All right, so our presenters for today are Gliselle and Kim. However, at this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to Abby. Take it away.
Thank you, Ruth. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Beyond the Paycheck, Optimizing Compensation Decisions and Employee Communication, hosted by HRSoft. Thank you for being here. We are thrilled to have you join us today. My name is Abby Sandbach. I am the VP of Marketing at HRSoft. And joining me today are comp experts Gliselle Ditto and Kim Conti. I will let them introduce themselves and share their experience. But before handing it over, as Ruth said, please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A. Kim and Gliselle will answer them at the end of the webinar. With that being said, thanks again for being here, and let's get started. Gliselle, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abby. Hi, everyone. Nice to see everyone on the line today. My name is Gliselle Ditto, and I lead our client solutions here at HRSoft, and I also help to guide our product strategy here. I'm in my 5th year with the company, and I've worked and consulted with many companies across all industries over the past 26 years as a practitioner, and also consulting to help customers tackle the reward challenges. With that, I'll pass it over to Kim.
Good day, everyone. My name is Kim Conti. I am a senior solution consultant here. Like Gliselle, I've been in HR and technology for more than 25 years. We started out our careers as practitioners and have been working together for a couple of decades now in practice. So very much looking forward to our time together today. And so with that, let's go ahead and take a look at our agenda. So HRSoft is an industry-leading unified purpose-built SaaS platform that is designed to help organizations streamline their compensation lifecycle planning. We take a client-first approach to our solutions and support, and we help companies in all industries all over the globe with their reward strategies to make sure that they're executed properly, support the programs that those organizations have implemented, and work as designed. And so with that in mind, today we're going to be bringing all of the experience that we've had most recently in dealing with all of our customers and prospects to bear in an open discussion here to talk about what things are happening out in the world of compensation. So with that in mind, we're going to take a look at things like aligning your compensation practices, trends that we're seeing in the industry, maximizing performance with compensation, as well as how organizations are starting to look more towards total rewards communications.
And as Kim mentioned, as we mentioned earlier, all the Q&A can be saved towards the end, but feel free to enter in any questions that you got along the way.
Excellent. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with a poll. And so to open our conversations today, what we'd like to know from our audience is, how does your organization currently align its compensation practices with its organizational objectives? And you should be seeing a poll popping up on your screen here shortly. There we go. Excellent. So your options as far as responses are, we have a pay for performance culture setting objectives and tying that to compensation outcomes. Your second option is, our funding for our compensation program is based on business performance. And then your last choice is, our awards are discretionary and decided by the management team. So the idea here is we'd like to get a little bit of a sense for what the audience is doing today so that we can incorporate that into how we address some of the topics going forward. We'll give everybody a few more minutes here, get some responses in. All right. How are we doing with regard to responsiveness? There we go. Okay, so let's talk about some of the results. For those organizations that have a pay-for-performance culture and are setting objectives and tying those objectives to your compensation outcomes, we have about a 57 response rate from the audience. Our second option around funding for compensation programs based on business performance comes in at about 28%. And then that last item around discretionary awards decided by management are coming in at about 16%. And so, Gliselle, how would you say that aligns to what we see when we're talking with our customers and our prospects to what this audience is seeing relative to the practices we're seeing in the market currently?
Yeah, I find that really interesting. I think what we've been seeing lately, especially, is more of a trend really towards that goal alignment. And whether that actually ties into compensation or not seems to be a little bit of a toss up. But the idea of at least having some sort of a performance culture that in the end may tie very specifically to incentive programs or different pay programs, and having that true alignment in the organization. It's nice to see that the trend is going in that direction, because I feel like that's probably the best way that organizations can ensure that they're meeting their objectives.
Awesome. You know, one of the things
So,
that oh, sorry, go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. I was just going to share, just getting into a little bit of the topic of today, thinking about how we can actually look at compensation as a very key strategic tool for any organization. By aligning compensation with organizational objectives, companies can truly motivate employees to be productive and efficient, and making sure that they actually are engaged and understand kind of their role in the success of the company. So during this session, we're going to spend a lot of time really diving into some of these details, but we'll be exploring how organizations can leverage comp practices to drive employee motivation, as well as productivity, and retention seems to be a big challenge these days. So this can really help to create a culture of loyalty and engagement through different types of compensation programs.
Yeah, those are all really important elements. But when we think in terms of how organizations get to that strategy, it's important to remember that oftentimes this requires a great deal of collaboration across the organizations, particularly based on the survey responses we just saw, right? So when we take a look at that first response coming in at near 60%, where organizations are working with a performance type structure or strategy, that means it's not something that HR is doing on their own. They're oftentimes collaborating with the businesses as well as finance. And the interesting thing about this is, you know, you and I both know that we see HR organizations and comp teams come in all different sizes and shapes these days. It's really, really interesting when you start to take a look at what the composition of compensation teams look like. Recent studies are showing that only about 1/3 of organizations have a dedicated compensation professional, and that includes mid-size organizations. So, you know, when you think about those 5,000 to 10,000 size organizations, that's a lot of employees to be administering compensation for, with a very light resource load. And then taking that a little bit further, just under 25% only have one resource dedicated to that. And so for folks like you and I who've sat in the chair and administered those types of programs, we know how much of a heavy lift that can be.
Absolutely. And I'd say too, just to add to that, thinking about the strategies towards really working in that alignment in those goals, I think part of what that also does is it brings every member of the organization into that process and ensuring that alignment. And that doesn't just end up being a compensation or even an HR practice. It's really getting down into those line managers working with their employees. So that's really important.
Incentive and reward programs can heavily impact employee retention, as we've been talking about here. One of the interesting trends that we've seen is a lot of organizations are shifting and trying things. We all know that the world changed 5 years ago in ways that, you know, we've all lived through, and many of us are probably still working through some of that PTSD from it. But the reality is, when you're offering the right incentives, regardless of how much the market is moving, how nimble you're required to be, leveraging all different types of programs is a trend that we're starting to see, including, you know, organizations that had characteristically only been doing short-term incentives are starting to look at other types of award components. And this can really help organizations achieve their goals while fostering a culture of engagement and loyalty. And when we think about all of the things that we just talked about in combination with the workforce that we're dealing with right now, it's not news to anybody. We have 4 generations in the workplace right now. And I think one of the things that we're starting to become more responsive to is first and foremost, knowing what the objectives of the organization are, but then trying to get to a point where you can drill down and make those rewards really meaningful to a broad set of employees that can include, organizations that are planning in different industries. Some are domestic, some are global. The company life cycle. Are you a startup? Your rewards are going to look really different when you're working in that type of an environment compared to legacy organizations, as an example. And then when you start getting into that more granular level, like we were just talking about, when you start to take a look at vertical business units or lines of business or even regions and departments and divisions, those things can really have an impact on the motivation and retention as well as the objectives of the organization. But then there's another slice and dice, I think, that's really kind of come to the forefront recently, which is dealing with the different types of employees that you're working with, the varying skills and responsibilities, as well as the various life stages of the 4 generations that we have in the workplace. Because I know for me, I'm looking at particular things that are important to me in my particular stage of life. And when I sit down and have conversations with my adult daughter, she's looking at really different things. So being able to have not only those goals and objectives and the compensation tied to the company's objectives, but have them really truly be tied to what's important to your employee base.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I also, just in preparing for this, started to do a little bit of studying just in terms of what's actually happening out there right now and how companies are leveraging different types of incentives. So most recent studies seem to show that the vast majority of publicly traded companies are leveraging some sort of short-term and long-term incentives. We're talking upwards of 99% are actually using short-term incentives. And just behind that, 94% are using long-term incentives. So that's pretty large. And I think that's actually increased quite a bit, especially over the last few years. Many changes are really happening in the total reward strategies as a result, of course, as you mentioned, of the recent pandemic, and incentives really seem to be a big part of that. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and jump into another poll. And this one, again, is just to get some more information to understand where your organizations are. So what type of incentives does your organization currently offer your employees? Are you looking at discretionary annual bonuses, annual performance-based incentives or salary adjustments, quarterly or more frequent performance-based incentives, and then a mix of short-term and long-term incentives? And I know you may not squarely fall in one of those 4 choices, but you kind of get the gist of kind of the complexity or the different cadences that your companies might be in.
Glazelle, one of the interesting things that I've noticed, and I know that this is something that we see organization-wide, is while we may be working with organizations that have characteristically used short-term incentives, the increase in the number of organizations either actively rolling out a long-term incentive program or taking a look at doing that in the near term is really interesting. The shift in that going back and forth has been fascinating lately.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then also, even on the flip side of that, different ways that we're thinking about things outside of a typical annual or even a quarterly cadence is happening quite a bit too. So it looks like we have the results in. It looks like at the top is the annual performance-based incentives or salary adjustments coming in at 43%. Right behind that at 38%, it's a mix of short-term and long-term. And then at 17%, only 17% are doing discretionary annual bonuses, and I'm assuming that only. And then the smallest percentage is 2% of our participants are quarterly or more frequent performance-based incentives. One thing that I would note about this, again, thinking about the compensation teams and the leanness of a lot of the compensation teams, one of the things that I've also been finding is that there may be incentives that are not even necessarily managed by comp. So as we think about some of those more frequent incentives, they may be department level incentives that are happening. Maybe they have some budget that are set aside for those types of things, spot awards and so on. So there may not be as much visibility within the comp team of some of those frequent incentives that are happening. as we go in and start consulting with our customers and we start to dive a little bit deeper into what's happening, they'll make these realizations that, oh yeah, somebody just sends me a file to process in payroll, and we'd like to get a handle on all of those things that are happening. So just something to consider when we're thinking about even some of those frequent programs.
Definitely have a need to lean into that collaboration to make these effective.
Yeah. So we're going to dive into a little bit about short-term incentives now. Short-term incentives are really a great way to keep employees motivated and engaged in that short run. So thinking about things that happen within typically your calendar year or your fiscal year. They really help to build momentum, encourage quick results, and they can help employees meet immediate goals. The different types of short-term incentives and how they can actually be used to encourage employee engagement would be things like those formal AIP programs, which are most common. I think around 90% of the public organizations that we have found are doing at least some sort of an annual formal program. A little more than 50% are offering those to non-exempt employees too. So that's another shift that we've been seeing, is also providing some incentives where maybe you haven't been doing so in the past. It could have only been relegated to management level and above in the past, and they're starting to have incentives that are really going down to your non-exempts as well. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about discretionary bonuses, but along with that could be things like retention bonuses and different ways that those can be managed. Around 35% of those publicly traded companies are using that in some shape, form, or fashion. Again, it's probably pretty sporadic, but they are definitely there.
You know, all of those items seem to track with what we've been seeing from the responses in this particular discussion with our audience today, in addition to what we're seeing in the marketplace. And with that in mind, you know, the fact that we've been talking about organizations are trying different things, one of the items that we took a look at as we were preparing for this was, you know, the velocity of change in the marketplace. We all know it's there inherently. I feel like we're all feeling it for sure. And in our research, we went ahead and took a look at a couple of different studies. The one that I thought, you know, really drove it home for me was the Accenture Pulse of Change indicator. And I was just blown away, because I feel like, as folks who are, you know, regularly working in the compensation industry, working with different comp administrators and teams of all different sizes, we all inherently feel this. But this particular Accenture study really backed it up, and the numbers were staggering to me. So when we think in terms of the velocity of change that we've all been enduring since the end of 2019 to right now, this number was mind-blowing for me. There is a 183% increase of change velocity in the marketplace in the last 5 years. And, you know, I have those mornings where I wake up and I look in the mirror and I think to myself, oh my gosh, I don't know how I've lived through this. But then you see a number like that and you're like, yeah, I definitely am feeling that. And then when we take that into consideration in just the last 12 months, right? Because the way time seems to go right now is a little bit different. In just the last 12 months, it's been a 33% increase in the rate of change that organizations are dealing with out there. And so what that means for so many organizations is they have to be very nimble about how they're taking a look at the programs that they set sometimes even just 6 months ago, and determine, was that something that was working? Do we have we given it enough time for the results that we think that we should have gotten? And how can we start to meet the market in a more nimble and agile way? And so some of the things that we're seeing are primarily those frequency around awards. One of the primary things that I think that we've definitely seen for sure is, for organizations who were previously doing some sort of short-term incentive program on an annual basis, they've really shifted most commonly to a quarterly cadence. And that totally makes sense when you think in terms of how do you motivate and retain your employees. Waiting for another 6 or 9 months to get to some sort of an award around your short-term performance is a long time. And that opens up the doorway for your key employees to start to take a look around and see what the market might be offering. So we're definitely seeing this trend. So not sure how folks in the audience are going to take a look at that, but just know that that is definitely something that is very commonplace that we're seeing right now. Another item that we're seeing, and this again ties to that first survey question that we had around what types of structures do you have for your compensation programs, not only tying it to organizational objectives and having metrics, but really taking a more holistic approach and starting to incorporate some scorecarding metrics into how those short-term programs are put into place. And what that does is it really allows organizations to get to that refinement of things that are important, not only for the organization, but for the different portions and pieces of the organizational structure that they're working with, right? So a particular organization that has manufacturing in a particular country may want to take a different approach and have some additional scorecard metrics for those particular locations. You can even get down to, those granular department areas with a scorecard. So those are really much more meaningful. They make it personalized for the employees. It really helps drive those results. The other piece that we're seeing is recognition programs, and they're coming in a lot of different forms and fashions. Oftentimes they're spot awards, which are cash on the spot. Glazell and I come from a retail background. So when you think in terms of what's happening in those store locations, that's a pretty high turnover employee environment. So having the ability to reward someone on the spot is really important. We're seeing that trend in some manufacturing environments as well to make sure that you're, hitting your production metrics and your safety metrics and things like that. I feel like those are the types of things that really help supplement some of the higher level programs. And even if you're not going to think about changing your annual program to be more frequent, we're seeing organizations using that annual program in combination with some of these more frequent recognition programs, and oftentimes even getting down to a monthly cycle. I think this really ties into, again, that generational aspect of the audience of employees that we're working with, knowing that we've got 4 generations, and that doesn't look to change anytime soon. So many of the generations, and I'm not going to pigeonhole any one of them because I find that really annoying, because I personally like a lot of feedback and I definitely don't fit into the millennial category, but I feel like given the velocity of change that we're all dealing with and trying to figure out how we're doing the right things in the workplace and being a good employee, making a contribution to what we're doing, the general gist of what we're seeing out there is employees want to see more feedback. And that can come in a lot of different ways, whether it's a recognition program that maybe doesn't have any monetary value to it. Maybe it's just recognition for your expertise in the organization, as an example, is important feedback regardless of what generation you happen to be in. So those things are definitely trends around more frequency and being much more creative around how you're going to make those awards. And that really aligns with that, the survey of the pulse of change, because if we've been experiencing 33% just in the last year, what's that going to look like going forward? We have to continue to be really nimble and really start to be predictive in how we're looking at our strategies on this.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I want to double down into a little bit of what you were just mentioning, thinking about even on that quarterly or monthly cadence. I think one thing that we tend to think about is whether we actually mean you're going to have quarterly payouts or you're going to have different programs quarter after quarter. Sometimes all that really means is that I have an annual incentive plan. I may have a quarterly check-in to review my goals to make sure that those goals are still where they need to be, or if we need to pivot because things are changing in our business so quickly. I think that gives us a little bit more freedom to be able to realign our goals on a quarterly basis and maybe have an incremental payout that goes with that if it is tied to that compensation piece. But more so, I think it's more about that visibility into what those goals are as you're going through your performance year and making sure that you're staying in line and that you're staying motivated and that you're having to pivot when it's necessary. And then in the end, you might still have that annual payment that's needing to be managed too. So it may be a little bit of a hybrid approach. I don't think it's more, some of the traditional quarterly metrics and quarterly payments per se. I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag when it comes to how those things are handled.
We've definitely moved away from the early days when we were both comp analysts, when you kind of set it and forgot it. And people would look back on it as they were getting ready for performance reviews. Those days are definitely gone.
Exactly. So if we could talk a little bit about the long-term incentives piece too. Again, just diving into some of these details, looking at how long-term incentives can really be powerful tools for promoting employee retention and loyalty. And again, I feel like this is where we're starting to see a little bit of a hybrid approach on some of these things. Looking at the different types of long-term incentives, and some of them may not be traditional in terms of what we usually think about, but appreciation based, so increasing in companies' value over time, things that are time-based, so granted after a specific period of time, kind of, in essence, not having any upfront cost to the employee, but making sure that you're actually looking at retention over time and progress over time as well, usually used for grants like below the executive level. Performance-based also, looking at achieving a reward achievement of specific performance targets. And again, now we're talking about some of those long-term targets instead. So the longevity of a company and not just simply what's happening within this particular performance year. And then there's different types of cash-based programs too. So they may be based on company or individual performance, but they're pretty popular with private companies because that usually doesn't cause any kind of dilution of ownership there.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing some trends in this area. And, when we think about how this looked previously, oftentimes these long-term incentives were really reserved for the highest levels of the executives in an organization. And, as the work environment that we're all in has changed dramatically, it's become much more fast-paced, much more collaborative. The need to be nimble in your work environment, not just from a comp strategy perspective, but how you actually execute, really has necessitated broadening these types of awards to different types of employees in the organization. And in fact, these are the types of things that are really helping with retention. So, I think we saw, especially as we were embarking on what turned out to be quite a lengthy pandemic, hiring was a challenge and getting people to get on board was really difficult. So we saw a major shift towards some of those sign-on bonus programs, and it was all the rage and very hot. And then as we got into the pandemic, the hiring became much more difficult, and retention was a big issue because employees learned that they could very easily start to hop around, maybe take advantage of some of those signing bonuses and move from job to job to help augment their own personal finances. And being able to extend long-term incentives to various classes and types of employees really helped slow down that churn in the marketplace with regard to hiring and retention. More companies are also taking a look at equity type programs. This is really pretty straightforward. If the company does well, you do well. That is in perfect alignment. And again, driving that down past your executives and even your senior leadership into folks who are potentially leaders, but even those individual contributors, it helps them tie what they do on a day-to-day basis, how they're making a difference to the organization, much more meaningful. And it makes them much more likely to be taking a look at not just what am I doing today, this month, or this quarter, but what is my contribution over a long period of time and the return that I'm going to get from that. All levels in the organization, we're not seeing so much on a part-time basis, but even getting down to hourlies in organizations is not uncommon. And offering the ability to have deferrals is something that's really interesting. Again, that is a concept that was really previously reserved for executive compensation. We're starting to see that coming down into other levels. Obviously, with deferred compensation, there's things to take into consideration. We're going to talk about this in just a second. Not something that you can offer to all employees, but companies are being much more creative and thinking a little bit more strategically in how they can bring in other employee types at various levels to bring them in so that you can think about that. And for me, as somebody who's thinking about what retirement might look like someday, those are the types of things that are motivating for, again, different employee types in the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think I mentioned that I've also been seeing a little bit of a hybrid approach when it comes to what we traditionally think about as long-term incentives and short-term incentives. And one area that I've seen that is where you have, whether it's sign-on bonuses or any kind of referral bonuses and things like that, where normally we say, oh, you'll get a particular sign-on bonus after you've been here for 6 months or 8 months or whatever the cutoff is. And now we're starting to see kind of incremental payments over time where you might have the first increment of that paid after you've been here for 6 or 9 months. And then the next increment doesn't happen until you're in year 2. So there's a little bit of that crossover between those two, both from, I think, really to kind of drive those retentions and thinking about, again, trying to balance out awarding people just in time as well as encouraging long-term retention and long-term success. And I think people are starting to implement programs that kind of touch on both aspects of that.
I also feel
So
that
you
those
mentioned, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no worries. I also feel like, when we think in terms of the different employees and what motivates them at different life phases, this is another one of those items that we think in terms of, what has traditionally been senior leadership, which are usually indicative of a particular career stage, if you will. Those
Right.
more frequent awards, particularly for those long-term incentives, can help individuals who are thinking about, what am I going to do to pay for my children's college? An incremental payment in that long-term incentive can be hugely helpful. And even folks who are thinking about maybe that first-time home purchase, those are the types of creative ways that you're taking a look at some programs that have been traditionally reserved for higher level executives and drive those into your broader employee base and really help with that motivation and make it much more personalized depending upon where you are, not only as an employee, but also from a life stage perspective.
Yeah, that is a great observation too. I think what we've also started to see a trend in, and I don't know that we've specifically called it out in some of the broad topics that we're talking about here, but we've seen a trend in some companies actually giving their employees some choice in how they're being paid. And that may be kind of bleeding into this next topic about deferred compensation. That may be one aspect of it, but to your point, I may come into the company with a particular short-term incentive plan, my whole compensation program that's there, but I may have the option to also turn around and invest in my company some portion of that short-term incentive that I'm receiving as well. And oftentimes, what we've seen traditionally with deferred compensation is that there are certain industries and certain employee levels that may be required. And it's more to mitigate risk at those levels and so on and so forth. But then what we've also found is that there are some companies that are actually utilizing this to, again, foster some sort of a sense of engagement and loyalty to a company, knowing that I believe in what we're doing and I want to also invest in our company and what we're doing through putting some of my incentives into more of a deferred compensation type of a program. So it's kind of, again, of our career at all. And definitely things that are extending way beyond the executive level and management level of an organization. Now, one other thing that I would want to bring up here, just thinking about the deferred compensation piece too, is there are, of course, tax implications that are around that as well. Again, usually coming into play as you're nearing those higher tax brackets and some of those employees that are sitting more at that executive team level. But I feel like even now there's a little bit more visibility into that as we're thinking about inflationary rates these days and not necessarily having a lot of control over what our budgets are in terms of what we're spending and those salary increases. But the incentive side seems to have a little bit more fluidity in terms of how we're managing that.
So again, let's talk a little bit more about the velocity or the frequency associated with this. We've talked a little bit about how these more frequent incentives in whatever forms they might happen to come in can really help teams stay motivated and achieve short-term goals and provide positive feedback. So it really covers a lot of the concepts that we've been introducing here. And all of that really supports the organization in its much larger goal. Couple of things that we've seen through, some of the other components that tie into our platform, particularly from a pay for performance perspective. I feel like compensation is now getting caught up. When we think in terms of pay for performance and performance management in general, I feel like there's been a trend in recent years around supporting that desire for employees to have better feedback. So the concept of more frequent check-ins and being able to see where you are from a status perspective, whether you're actually getting an incremental payout that has more frequency than what has been traditionally happening out there, or if it's a spot award, or if it's one of, a lot of other different types of components. We've talked a little bit about how some of these more frequent awards aren't necessarily based in a monetary or cash award that you see inside of your paycheck. So things like team outings, additional time off, which is something that is really a popular option these days, different types of company outings, recognition programs. Within our own organization, we've found that taking the time to do things like community service work as a way to give back is one of those things that is a great way to, it's not necessarily recognition, but you feel like you're making a difference and you as an organization are giving back, and you get to do a little bit of team building. You're looking at a different place other than the four walls of your office, or maybe that screen that you're constantly tied to. So the different types of programs that you can have and the different types of combinations that we're seeing is really allowing people to be much more creative and meet the needs of an organization, while making sure that people are getting that personalization that they need. So for me, maybe that spot award isn't necessarily super motivating, but having a day where I can go and give back in my community and do something meaningful that helps the community that I live in can be one of those frequency type awards that can really help with my motivation and fill up my cup and refresh my day. So the ability to be creative around these is really important. And we've talked about the fact that we're seeing different industries are taking a look at different frequencies. Again, those ideas around organizations like retail and manufacturing, call centers are another great example of having that monthly cadence, or even an on the spot because you did something extraordinary today, are really important types of programs. Did you want to talk a little bit more about some of the trends that we're seeing out there with some of these, Lizelle?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you mentioned some of it, but definitely seeing that trend towards that quarterly, I feel like that's kind of a manageable time frame. But as you think about those department level type incentives that tend to happen more on a monthly or even sometimes a weekly cadence. And usually that ties to parts of the organization that are looking at productivity metrics and such. I think about a particular customer that we've had recently where they have call center associates that are basically being measured on a daily basis on the calls that they're taking, the time that they're taking on the phones, escalation, so on and so forth. And they even have, in essence, like daily awards that are being given to them. And because this happens to be a bank card company, they can get those deposited straight into their bank cards overnight as well. So there is kind of that frequency and that motivation that happens at that level, but then also kind of understanding the longer term implications around that. What other types of programs do they potentially have access to as well? But we are seeing quite a bit of an uptick in those types of programs. And to your point, they're not always necessarily cash based. We can see a lot of different ways that people are being rewarded and motivated, not necessarily any kind of monetary layout at all. So companies are definitely getting creative there. The other thing that we've also been seeing, I think, a little bit of an uptick in is thinking about project-based or team-based types of incentives as well. So again, we try to put everything in a little nice, neat compartment of things that happen quarterly as compensation practitioners. But the reality is business doesn't function that way. And those of us that are in the consulting side of the house know that you have project after project that don't align to our quarters whatsoever. So a lot of companies have started to look at being able to provide some sort of incentives based on project completion and success and so on.
And much like what we had seen from, a performance management shift drilling down into compensation with that frequency kind of making its shift through the different components of the disciplines that HR is responsible for. It feels to me like one of the things that we used to be really very rigid around was, performance reviews, right? It wasn't necessarily project-based. That always got measured, but oftentimes it was in an offline format. I feel like bringing in the scorecard concept also supports that project-based efforts. And one of the things that I think had been a struggle for a lot of organizations was, the calendar year or your particular organization's fiscal year doesn't necessarily fit into a nice, neat 12-month bucket when it relates to how you actually get project work done in your organization. So, knowing that we're talking to an HR audience, in all likelihood, there's been some implementations that have happened inside of our audiences. And I would gather a guess that maybe they didn't happen in the exact 12-month time frame that the calendar year happened in. Oftentimes they go 18, 24 months. And oftentimes, we see this even with our own customers. Oftentimes that big bang approach to different projects doesn't work. So you have projects that are now incrementally phased in, and being able to take not only the, how you measure that from a performance perspective, but incorporating that across the board, I really think helps employees understand better how they're making the contribution holistically versus I worked on this project and I got some great accolades over there, but then my performance review came over there. I've always felt like there's been an inherent disconnect there. And now that we're being more creative in how we're taking a look at not only putting together the different strategies to achieve company goals, but how those get paid out and the methodologies in which we're rolling these out from a process perspective into the organization really helps us be a lot more nimble. Right? We're not stuck in that rigid, it has
absolutely.
to be a calendar year, right?
Absolutely. And actually that rolls right into the next topic that I know we wanted to dive into, thinking about maximizing performance through compensation. And you were just mentioning that, things around looking at how we're actually doing our performance evaluations. Most of us, I think, have strayed from the notion of just an annual performance review and started to really encourage those ongoing conversations. And this actually ties right back to what we were talking about in the very beginning. This is a collaboration between the compensation teams, the performance teams, the management teams, and so on, because we're all intended to be working towards the same goals across the board. So as we think about that, how does that tie to the compensation practice? How does that tie to the performance management practice and process? Employees tend to be motivated by the ability to grow in their careers and to work as part of a successful team. And I think what we've found recently is that a lot of organizations are starting to try to be more agile in general. Again, tied back to how much change we've experienced over the last several years, and especially over the last 2, 3, 4 years. I think that's kind of forced us to be a little bit more agile in all industries and having to react very quickly to things that are happening externally and internally. And that will tie into how we're looking at performance and how performance is potentially tying to our specific compensation practices. Now, again, it doesn't have to be a nice, clean quarterly cadence or anything like that. I think there's a lot of room for some fluidity in that, but it's really thinking about that overall, I'd say the balance of the effectiveness of that performance management strategy and the pay for performance philosophy. It's looking at what is the end game and making sure that we're going through the right processes for the right reasons rather than just, adhering to a process that we've had all along. Do you have anything else to add to that or any other little tidbits? I know we've kind of been touching on this already through most of this.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me as somebody who's worked across all of the HR disciplines over the course of my career. There was a period of time where everything was really, tied to your performance rating, right? And having those conversations, and it was pretty rigid. And the way that those things were set up was, reasonably consistent. If you were an exempt employee, you usually had one type of performance review, and if you were non-exempt, you had another type. And it was not really meaningful in many ways to some of those employees. And then because there was a disconnect of, how we were measuring and what the feedback was from the employee audience was, lots of organizations were like, you know what? These don't make any sense. We're walking away from them, right? There was a period of, time where people were like, we're absolutely not doing this. And I feel like what has happened is we've been trying things in the industry, and we've kind of come back to this concept of we absolutely need to be measuring on a regular basis. And sometimes that means mid-years or even quarterly performance reviews in addition to check-ins or some sort of cadence that works for each organization individually. But I think the underlying theme here that ties from both performance into compensation is that ability to be nimble and personalized, right? So when we're talking with our customers who really are starting to take a very hardcore look at how do I implement my pay for performance structure, oftentimes there's one component of a performance review that is tied very specifically to the compensation outputs. And that, again, really goes back to the concept that we introduced earlier around some organizations really rely heavily on a scorecard for certain portions of their organization, but that might not be applicable. You still very much have individual goals. So, what am I making a contribution to from that perspective, taking a look at your career pathing and your individual development inside of an organization. So what we're seeing is a lot less consistency across how you're doing that performance rating. And again, I feel like those things are really starting to work in tandem from that perspective into compensation. And so again, driving into that collaboration, depending upon how you're structured as an organization. I know I worked in organizations where one person in HR did a lot of those different disciplines around performance reviews and, talent management and compensation. And other organizations have, full teams that can cover those things. The ability to be nimble and execute really requires that level of collaboration and true strategic thinking from the HR team in total to make sure that these things are working and producing the results that you need.
Absolutely. And that's a definite strong trend that I've been seeing across many organizations.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about the different components, a lot of the trends that we're seeing. We've talked a lot about how some organizations are trying this and it works, and other organizations are trying that and it works. And one of the things that you and I talk about a fair amount in our day-to-day existence is, all of these programs are great, but if people don't understand them and understand the value to them, they're not really meaningful. So with that, let's jump into poll number 3. We're looking to get some feedback on how does your organization communicate its total reward package to its employees. This is a single choice, so pick the one that is most like your organization. We have 3 choices here. First and foremost, generic communications that happen during benefits enrollment time. Your second option is we communicate through compensation changes and awards at the time that they are awarded. So basically at the end of cycles where you're making payouts, you're putting out those communication statements. Or your final choice is we provide comprehensive total rewards communication at least once a year. Another hot topic.
This one always elicits a lot. Yeah, it always elicits a lot of conversation because this really spans way beyond what a lot of compensation practitioners are really focused on too.
And, one of the things we saw in the pandemic was a lot of organizations, because of having to be so nimble and figure out how you executed on all of your HR stuff, many of them put a pause on it. And I think that that's had some negative consequences. So let's see what our poll results say here.
Agreed.
So going from the top down, the second item was the highest response rate. So we communicate our changes through compensation changes and awards at the time that those awards are made. So that was 54%. So more than half of organizations are absolutely doing that. That's great news. And then providing comprehensive total rewards communications at least once a year comes in at second place at 24%. Followed very closely behind those generic communications during benefits enrollment time at 21%. So, it's so fascinating to me, these polls as we do them. They come up a little bit different every time that we take a look at it. But this one in particular really strikes at the level of, experimentation, if you will, in how organizations are addressing this and the types of things we're seeing right now.
Agreed. And I think you mentioned it briefly. We found that a lot of organizations have sort of paused those communications, in the midst of the pandemic. And we are definitely seeing an uptick in more interest in what can we do to be more transparent about our total rewards communications. Again, I think there's a lot of things that are going on in industry that are kind of forcing their hand in this. Part of it is looking at that employee retention. Part of it is some of the things that are happening with regards to regulations and such that are definitely creeping up on us. I think transparent total rewards communications is really critical when we think about building employee trust and engagement. And that's really across the board. Again, part of what I think companies are running into is bandwidth issues, being overwhelmed by the task of it. What does that actually mean But I think it can happen kind of in increments, and something is better than nothing. But it is important to communicate with your employees in an open and transparent way about your compensation packages and practices, and to be open about how decisions are being made. Now, again, I feel like maybe the trend towards a little bit more of a scorecard type of an approach helps to mitigate some of that. How are these decisions being made? It's very metric driven and so on. But I think the hybrid approach that I've also seen, where there's metrics that are driving things and there's still individual performance as well that may tie into it. It's making sure that managers are equipped to make those decisions appropriately, to actually communicate how these decisions are being made whenever there are any kind of discretionary adjustments that are happening. And even at the higher level, how are we budgeting for these things? You know, when we're looking at the push and pull between what's happening with inflationary constraints that we have, and knowing that we've got to try to keep up with inflation, even just in our budgets for our salary plans, but then starting to think about how we need to look at incentives and continue to motivate people. We're always dealing with this push and pull in that area, but we need to be transparent to our employees that this is happening and this is our practice and what we're looking at doing. It also allows employees to fully understand and appreciate their value within the organization, so which in turn will enhance their satisfaction and engagement levels. Again, we've been talking about this from the beginning, that alignment of your own goals and what role you play within the organization to the overall success of the organization not only helps from a performance perspective, but then if that's tied into the compensation side, it really helps to motivate as well. It's also interesting to know that since the pandemic, total reward statements, again, have been coming back. We've sort of been talking about that, but it's coming in many shapes and sizes, many different transformations around that. Again, I feel like at least with the customers that have come to us, it tends to be a little bit of an overwhelming conversation, because back in my days as a practitioner, I was not necessarily responsible for all of those things that we want to make sure that we're including in a total reward statement. I may be responsible for a certain cash portion of it or the long-term incentive portion of it. And it really does then require that you have that collaboration across the team and make sure that you're also working with everybody to understand the messaging that you're getting across to your employees. But with that in mind too, I'm thinking about all of the different organizations and where they are in this pendulum of the progress of that total rewards communications. Part of it is that transparency in the things that we do have control over. To your point, helping employees to actually understand their compensation package. And as much as we talk about this scorecard approach to things, the flip side to that is to be super cautious about how complicated we make something. If a manager can't explain it to an employee who is going to be their first line manager, the first line communications when it comes to any kind of compensation challenges that they have, if a manager isn't able to explain it to their own employee, then we might need to take a step back and look at, are we communicating it clearly? Is it actually meeting the objectives that we have? Is it too specific? You know, again, all of those things that work with, it will work differently with different companies, different industries, and taking all of those variations in mind. Did you have anything else that you might want to add to that? I know it's kind of wrapping it all up into, the end game, but
there's so much here. I mean, I think one of the issues is, and I'm not going to name names here, but even at this juncture, having been in the industry so long, I find it shocking how many organizations are doing these types of statements in a manual format in a mail merge. So just know that if you are one of those companies that's doing that, you are absolutely not alone in doing that. And it is a significant burden. There's a lot of, area for risk and error in that. And when you're doing it that way, it makes it hard to add some of those total rewards things that companies spend good money on that aren't necessarily visible. One of the things that we are definitely seeing are some of those augmented discount programs where companies are taking the base of their employees and leveraging that buying power and going to organizations and saying, hey, we want to get a significant discount on insurance programs or cell phone programs. And if employees don't understand what that looks like, and I know for me personally, I gave up paying my cell phone bill because my daughter has a program through her employer that provides me a much better discount on my cell phone. And let's face it, who doesn't want to make your cell phone bill cheaper these days? Because month over month, that adds up. And being able to display those things, that's really hard to do if you're doing that in a manual environment. So ensuring that you're using some sort of tool or platform that can help with that is really important. And that's one of the things that, inside of our organization, we have the ability to do those end of cycle statements that are purely compensation focused. We can add in some of those total rewards components in an automated fashion, so you're not having to go through that heavy lift. And then the last thing that we're seeing is so many more of our customers who have, taken the steps to either reinstate those statements or have gone to the next level and added some of those total reward components at the end of cycles for awards, are now taking the leap and moving into those portals that are available 24/7, 365, so that, if you get a great job offer and it's keeping you up at night and you're awake at 2 a.m., you can actually go out there and see real-time information around what the value of your current employment is. And that can be a real competitive advantage for some organizations.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think just one thing to add to that, you mentioned things like some of those perks that some employees get. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're needing to attach a monetary value to everything, but it is definitely showing all of those elements you mentioned earlier, even having that extra day to take to go do community service work and things like that. Some companies that I've run into have also said, let's put the retail value of some of these things that we're offering. Coming from the retail environment, even that employee discount that we would get going to the stores, no matter where we worked within the organization, what is the average spend that somebody has on their own clothing bill, over the course of the year, and how much of a discount are you getting with the company that you're working for? So things like that are actually, again, creative ways that we can help to bring those things to the surface and make sure that the employee truly understands the total value of their employment at a company.
So as we get to the top of the hour here, you're probably wondering, what are the conclusions that we have here? And so I think one of the things you've probably noticed is, and Glizelle, I'm going to prompt you to go ahead and move on to the next slide here. There's really a nimbleness and agility, and organizations are out here trying things, and that is goodness for the organization and the employee. The reality is the only thing that we can really count on these days is that, change is going to be the consistent. There's nothing that's going to be certain. And if there's anything that we've learned from the last few years of working inside of HR, boy, it's been an adventure. And I think that this is going to continue to be the trend going forward. We're all going to have to figure out, as the dynamics of the world that we live in and the workplaces that we're in, and how we keep our families healthy and housed and contributing to society, it's really going to be an adventure. So with that in mind, I know we're at the very top of the hour, but wanted to check in to see if Abby has any questions that were top of mind in the chat as we've been chatting away here today.
Yeah, so I know the chat was very busy, so if we don't get to all your questions, we can definitely do that in the follow-up. But I know several people asked about if we had any specific data around incentives and bonuses, and if in particular, if there were any trends specific to any specific industries around bonuses and incentives.
Again, I think part of that is looking at where you've been granting bonuses historically versus what's actually starting to happen now. If you've traditionally only given incentives to your management team, the trend to actually expand that to a larger population and have it truly be relevant to what each of those employees are working on. So going back to aligning to those goals, looking at, even if it's 2 or 3 goals that I have for this year, that are aligning to my organizational goals and knowing how I'm contributing to that. I think I've been seeing that trend actually kind of across the board, and it's executed in different ways, of course. In certain industries and certain employee bases where you actually have more metrics driven type of incentives, you have to, of course, have the tools in place to be able to do those measurements and such. But again, balancing that out with, let's not make it too complicated. Let's not have 10 different metrics that I'm measuring against that have a very incremental effect on my overall performance and my overall compensation. But we have seen, as I mentioned, sort of a hybrid approach to how things are being managed today. And I don't think that that's even necessarily industry specific.
And sort of along the same lines, someone was wondering if we've seen a trend in increase in benefit retirement plans, like more defined.
Yeah, that's interesting. To be honest, there's been a little bit of a trend in different types of retirement programs, and I've even heard certain larger companies, known companies, have moved back to pension programs, which is also very interesting. So moving away from the 401ks that we've all been so used to contributing to these days, some of the larger, more established organizations are actually reopening their pension programs. So I am seeing a little bit of that. I don't know if other companies are going to start following suit, but I feel like that tends towards some of those more, like I said, mature organizations.
I think the other piece around that really ties back to our conversation around deferred comp and the fact that organizations
Exactly.
are starting to think more broadly around who's eligible. And it's oftentimes less around what's your employee type or where do you sit in the organization, but it's more about the life cycle of your career. So, if you're at a point where you're within, 5, 7 years of retirement, that might be a great way to institute a program that's very meaningful to that particular portion of your workforce. It's a great way to retain people, right? Keep that institutional knowledge. And I think that that's one of the things that we're starting to see that really speaks to that trend around the different levels of benefits that are being opened up in an organization.
And I think that doubles down on the idea that organizations are really starting to give employees more choice when it comes to how they're being paid. And again, it can help to answer to all of those different generations that are working in the organization, different places that you are within your life and what your priorities are today. So it's knowing that everybody is going to have a different way that they want to be paid because of that.
Looks like there's two more if we can stay on for that. For a global organization which has multi-country executives, how is target LTIP opportunity defined? Is it a percentage of base standardized across all countries, or is it driven by LTIP practices in each country?
That's a great question. It definitely has to be a little bit of a hybrid between those two things. There's some regulatory things that you need to take into account as you get into other jurisdictions. What we've generally seen is that you have to look at what's happening in the market in those various jurisdictions as well. Of course, we also have the notion of expats. You're actually a U.S. employee working elsewhere, but all of those have to be taken into consideration. And I think what it really boils down to is that it's not necessarily the same rules apply to everybody. You might have different programs based on where you're sitting, based on what your responsibility is. There may be some general guidelines that are set, maybe based on your employee level, the level of management that you are and such. But beyond that, you also have to take into account, of course, the regulations that you'll be needing to adhere to. And that especially comes into play when you start thinking about those high income earners and looking at that deferred compensation piece, certain areas where it's actually required that certain portions of their compensation be deferred, and understanding that too, but still giving some notion of choice in those areas too. Great question though.
All right, last question. I know we're losing some people, but how do organizations manage the pay for performance with pay equity regulations?
That is a very, very complicated question that I'm not sure we can get into too much, but it's just one aspect of what you're looking at when it comes to pay equity. Again, I'm sure everybody that's joined us today has gone through some level of pay equity studies. Performance is actually, absolutely one of those aspects that you need to consider, but you also need to backtrack and consider how you are looking at performance to see if that actually does technically justify those differentiations that you have. If it's a driver, if maybe it's actually uncovering issues in how your performance practices are being run as well. So it's a little bit of a bigger umbrella than, and I think that's actually a great topic for another day to dive into quite deeply. But it definitely is something, as I look at people that are companies that are going through pay equity studies, that you do have to take into account performance as you're looking at the equities or inequities. And it definitely can be a reason why somebody gets a larger bonus, of course, if they're in a successful part of the organization versus another end that was struggling.
Great. That's it.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much, Giselle. Thank you so much, Kim, for your knowledge and your time. All right. This webinar will be available for playback for up to 90 days. You simply have to log into the worldatwork.org and access your profile. Please allow 24 hours for the playback to appear. A reminder that we are going to email a short survey at the end of the event. Highly appreciate your feedback. All right, the SHRM and HRCI codes will now be available on your screen. Thank you, everyone. This will conclude today's webinar.